Hi, I'm Sarah Hall, Chief Curator and Director of Collections at the Frick Pittsburgh. Thanks so much for joining me for this video. Once again, I'm recording from home, and I hope everyone is doing well and is safe and healthy. And hopefully, if you are stuck at home, you're stuck with people you care about and getting the chance to spend some good time with each other. I know it's really hard. I've been separated from my sisters in particular, my brothers too, but my sisters and I have discovered Zoom happy hours, and I think we're not the only people who have found ways to try and connect while we're apart that are different, and we're doing that in the museum world as well. So we're working to figure out what it means to work with our collections from a distance and to try and maintain our relationships with you and try to make it so that when you come back to the museum, you feel maybe even a stronger connection and appreciation for the collection and the work that we all do together to bring art and culture and history and meaning to our lives, which I think are really important to us in difficult times in particular. So with that said, we're going to take a close look at a single painting in the collection today, and it's one that I love to talk about. And let me share my screen with you, and we'll get started with that. And I'm gonna disappear myself so that you just hear my voice. So Resisting the Rational, here in the title of this presentation, is a reference to Giovanni di Paolo's intensely imaginative painting. As I mentioned, I always enjoy introducing visitors to this painting because it's chock full of discoveries and delights. And in fact, I often tell the story of a man who came into the museum having read a Wall Street Journal article all about Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis at the Frick collection and these super high-res photographs that had been taken of it. And he got his two Fricks confused, came to the Frick Pittsburgh and asked to see St. Francis. Security actually came and got me, and they weren't sure what he was looking for. And I came out and I said, oh my goodness, the Bellini is indeed one of the most beautiful paintings in existence, and it would be lovely if we could walk back and look at it. But instead, let's walk back and look at Giovanni di Paolo's Nativity. And we did that together, and I think he really enjoyed it. So let's take a closer look today. So I wanted to set the painting in our context. This is Helen Clay Frick's collection of early Renaissance paintings, most of which she purchased pretty early in the 1920s. They were originally housed at the Frick Art Reference Library. She felt that these devotional panels were suitable for an environment of study. So she also really loved Italy. We know where she used to stay regularly when she went to Siena. She kept scrapbooks of her trips to Italy. She had a real personal connection to early Renaissance panel paintings, and they were indeed some of her earliest art purchases. So here in the beautiful gallery with its terracotta tile floor and silk damask wall coverings, you can see all the way to the right the Giovanni di Paolo painting. And it's not as clear here because what you're seeing on the left wall, the large Bacchiacca and the Melzi, they're sort of later Renaissance paintings. But if you could see the rest of the room, you would realize how quickly it stands out from the other early Renaissance panels because there's just so much going on. Often they're very sort of static, votive, devotional paintings with a single figure or, a much larger central figure. But the Giovanni di Paolo has a lot going on in it. And here you can see it again on the left, and the two paintings by Sassetta, his almost exact contemporary, hanging to the right. And they are the two most important painters in 15th century Siena and carriers on of the Sienese painting tradition, which I will talk about a bit in a moment. So I wanted to geographically orient us a little bit here as well, a quick visit to 15th century Siena. It's a reminder that Siena at the time of Giovanni di Paolo's life, so Giovanni di Paolo dies in 1483, and this map is circa 1494, so it's pretty much his lifetime. Siena was an independent commune. and as was Florence. And so they were deeply competitive. They were independently governed. They had their own statutes, seals, and coinage. Sometimes Sienese artists would get commissions in Florence and vice versa, but the art traditions grew up differently, and they're often spoken of in contrast to each other. I often call it the sort of tale of two cities kind of thing, although it's really tale of two communes. So Siena, if you notice on the map on the left, it is, between northern Italy and Rome, and so it's on an important pilgrimage route for folks heading down to Rome. It's also a really important trade route, and Siena is a wealthy city with an interest in luxury and living well, and this contributes to the painting tradition being one which uses a lot, even as moving from the Gothic to the Renaissance, the Sienese artists still love using their expensive pigments and lots of gold embellishment on their paintings. And just when I was showing the gallery photos, we actually have 8 Sienese paintings in the galleries. We have 4 earlier works from the 14th century and 4 later works from the 15th century. So there's a contemporary map of Italy. You can see Florence and Siena now set there as cities, and they're about 50 miles apart. So that gives you a sense of their proximity. And here's a view of Siena, and of course, the distinctive burnt Siena bricks that are used to construct a lot of the city. And it has this wonderful medieval character to it. So let's look at Duccio. This is a pretty famous painting that feels like the Met just bought it yesterday, but it was now over 15 years ago. And it was all over the media when the Met got this little devotional painting. It is Duccio from sometime between 1290 and 1300. So we're looking at, a full century and then some prior to when Giovanni di Paolo is working. His first documented work is, I believe, 1417. So we're looking at 100 plus years before that. And it's a lovely Madonna and Child. And you can see on the bottom, I love pointing this out to people, that there are losses from burn marks because of candles being placed in front of this. This was intended for private devotion, and when you knelt in front of it in prayer, the painting is kind of activated. You are then at the appropriate position, and you're in the right perspective to connect with these figures and have this, very intimate devotional experience. Duccio begins this sort of tradition of Sienese painting, the pictorial elegance that we associate with Siena. He begins working around 1278, and this really, Duccio and Giotto is associated with Florence and Duccio with Siena. They're sort of these two pillars at the beginning of the Western European art history trajectory, and they're often spoken of, in contrast and in tandem, because of the Sienese tradition being one based on the beauty of line and color and perhaps and decoration, and perhaps a little less interested in the humanist and scientific advances of the Renaissance. They hold on to that precious tradition. But you can see here how sweet this is with the little Christ child reaching up his hand towards his mother. It's very tender and sweet. And then, sorry for whatever's going on with this slide that I didn't fix, but you can see here, this is the front of Duccio's famous Maesta, which is a huge altarpiece in Siena, and it has, nearly life-sized figures with the beautiful enthroned Madonna. It has to do with the majesty of the Madonna, and all of these, this whole sort of cavalcade of characters around her, angels and donors and various people, and a lot of them with distinct facial expressions, in spite of the fact that they're kind of being stacked up very neatly so that we can see everybody's faces. So moving on a little bit here, this is now, we're much later. We're looking at Taddeo de Bartolo, who was probably Giovanni di Paolo's teacher, although there are some other theories as well. And in the meantime, after sort of Duccio's active to 1318, 1348 is when there is a huge wave of the plague, which decimates about 50% of the population of Siena. And so it really sort of grinds things to a halt. And it isn't until we have the rise of the 15th century painters like Giovanni di Paolo and Sassetta that we start seeing a resurgence in Sienese art. And that resurgence looks to the past and looks to the tradition that Duccio created. So Taddeo de Bartolo's dates are 1362 to 1422. And I chose this Adoration of the Shepherds to illustrate, because when we look at the Giovanni di Paolo, you'll see some similarities in the iconography and the way the Nativity is depicted. Another theory about Giovanni di Paolo is that his mother inherited the estate of an artist who is not a well-known artist at all, practically an unknown artist. And there's a thinking that he might have been her second husband, and that perhaps this second husband could have been an early instructor of Giovanni di Paolo's. His name was Nanni di Giovanni di Cercecco, I believe it is. So let's look at some other influences and things that were happening to Sienese art, in addition to this tradition of, decorative, luxurious, elegant, yet tender painting that we see sort of established by Duccio. We have the Limbourg Brothers here. What a charming image this is from the Très Riche, the Book of Hours. This is the month of February, and so a winter scene. The Limbourg brothers actually visited Siena in 1413. These three Dutch brothers are known for their part in establishing the international Gothic style, which is a sort of transitional style between the medieval Gothic and the Renaissance. And it has a lot of courtly painting in it, a lot of luxury. We'll see some more of that. But you see here, they're from the north, and this northern interest in depicting everyday life is seen in this, as well as we see the figures who are apparently inside this building lifting up their clothing so that they can get a little warmer, and this activity going on in the background, trudging up that hill through the snow with the donkey. I picked this image because you can see that sweeping line of the fence along the front, and then that road in the back that takes you into the background. It is really similar to the composition of the Giovanni di Paolo that we're going to look at more closely right now. So you can see that, having this slide be the next one, hopefully that is still in your memory. And let's take a look at the painting and then sort of take it apart a little bit. So what do we see when we look at it? I mentioned before that there's nothing really quite like it in the gallery. It's a complex composition with many figures. There's this really clear division between foreground and background, and it does contrast with the other sort of more static devotional paintings that we have in the collection. You have this sinuous line of the road that leads into the background, this mass of gilt halos and angel wings surrounding God the Father in the middle. This incredible miniaturist detail. Giovanni di Paolo is trained as a miniaturist, and he does illuminations as well as panel paintings, and apparently at least one documented fresco, though not many frescoes. But you can see in those fruit trees and in the halos and the massing of the angels, and there's a peacock there that we'll look at another image because you probably can't see it well here, but this incredible jewel-like miniaturist detail happening. And there's so many things to look at yet there is this sense, and I think that curving composition creates this, of a real completeness. There are also mysteries, I think, in this painting. Why are those figures turned outward at the bottom? Joseph in his yellow cloak, and then the two women on the other side turning away. And I think we also see miracles in this painting because, of course, it's a painting of the Nativity. And if you look in the background, the shepherds are back there with the sheep, and the angel has bringing them the tidings of the birth of the Lord, and they are looking up with astonishment. In fact, even their dog is looking up with astonishment. And then there are the shepherds arriving with their dogs as you look down at the bottom right. So there's a sort of collapsing of time. We see a lot of things happening simultaneously here that together tell us the complete story of the birth of Christ. We have wise men leaving that walled city, heading down the road over a little bridge, and we'll look at those in more detail as well. But those wise men also can stand in for the Roman soldiers who will eventually arrest Christ. And in fact, the nativity taking place in a cave allows for that cave to evoke the symbolism of his tomb. So you really get the whole story of the birth and the death of Christ in this one sort of painting that is packed with such incredible narrative detail. So I'm going to just show you some. So here we have the sort of main story. This is a story that is very familiar in Christian iconography, and this wonderful holy light emanating from the baby. We have, Mary on her knees. One interesting thing to point out is, imagine if she stood up, the odd elongated proportions of her body and how much of her upper body there is, and how low her knees would be in comparison to the rest of her. These elongated, very sort of attenuated, expressive figures of Giovanni di Paolo are not unique to him, but he does emphasize this, and it gives a sort of tension and expressiveness to his figures that to some people feels very contemporary. And the women on the side who, both Joseph and the one woman who seem to be turned away, and Joseph may be sleeping, but I get a sense of grief and sadness. And of course, those figures turning away also move our eyes away, so that if you were looking at the whole painting, that sort of sinuous, connected composition is connected by their postures as well. And then here's a detail of that central portion that I talked about with the amazing sort of miniaturist painting. We have God the Father in the center with this legion of angels and their amazing wings that almost look like gilt pine cones all around them. And the Holy Spirit, it's the dove below. And one thing I love here is just pay attention, if you can, to those angels' faces. The angels are almost sort of casual. They have a sense of anticipation, particularly the one who is immediately to the right of God in the red gown, looks really excited in anticipating this, wonderful event that's taking place. And there seems to be, almost conversations as the gazes of different angels connect. And again, this really clever and charming. So these layers of halos stacked amongst each other, and you can see other little angel faces peeking at you between the halos of the angels in the front row. It's all really splendid and a lot of gold. So this use of gold in the midst of this, narrative painting really does connect it to the Sienese decorative tradition, and also to Giovanni di Paolo's, training as a miniature painter and an illuminator. And then looking at the top of the painting, where suddenly it is kind of like we're in the real world. One of the things, I ask people is, does this painting look like it's the real world? And there are elements of it that are mystical and supernatural, and there are elements of it that are fairly naturalistic, even if not rendered with scientific perspective or the kind of realism that we are accustomed to today. So here in the background, this landscape, I love these hills, and this a little bit of atmosphere happening as those hills fade into blue. And you have the angel who is heralding the arrival of Christ also sort of stands in for the star. You see the wise men there on the left, the Magi, who are, pointing upward. So they're following what they are seeing in the heavens. The shepherds' faces are, amazingly astonished. As I mentioned before, even the little dog is looking up to the heavens with a startled and surprised look on his face. And just to emphasize this circularity, probably unnecessarily so, but the way these figures on the sides turn outward and we have this movement, down this road from the background to the shepherds arriving here, and then the figure turned out here that sort of pushes our eye back again. There are the wise men who kind of do symbolic duty for what will happen later on in Christ's life when the soldiers come and arrest him. And we'll look at a painting that has a similar composition, and it is the Roman soldiers. So you'll see that. And just some comparisons here, again, more close-ups, that you see this intensity of emotion and his compelling pictorial storytelling. How writers and our historians have described him as imaginative, mystical, visionary, feverish, and as I mentioned before, the sort of nervous tension and expressiveness of the figures have really connected with contemporary artists in the 20th century, and many people feel like he kind of foreshadows the mannerists of the 16th century as well. His interest in sort of adapting the figure to emphasize emotion and tension. So some more unusual details here. We've looked at this before, but those figures turned out at the sides. The women also, so this melding of interest in an understanding, I think, of some of the Renaissance things that are happening, but a kind of Giovanni di Paolo is kind of picking and choosing the traditions he wants to follow. And those two female figures on the left are probably from an earlier medieval tradition of including midwives in depictions of the Nativity, which was not really that common at the time this painting was made. You have these, fruit trees around and different sort of observations of detail that evoke what we saw in the Limbourg Brothers. I think, there's a little bit of struggling with perspective of that little structure that comes off the cave that Mary is kneeling in front of, but you also have some modeling going on showing the dimensionality of the bricks and the architecture. So he's kind of picking and choosing things to serve his narrative, intricate and imaginative, kind of dense with different layers of imagery here. And again, looking at those really expressive figures and faces. I forgot I had a close-up of those angels that I had already talked about, but doesn't hurt to take another look. I think at this point, it's really clear that he's a storyteller. He's a really gifted storyteller. And it is, as I mentioned, it's about serving the narrative. So you have this elegant and expressionistic postures that look back to earlier painting traditions. You have this sort of stacked composition with the background just appearing higher than the foreground, which is a kind of hierarchical style that looks back to the Byzantine. But all of these choices are serving his narrative. And the peacock here, finally showing you the peacock, is a symbol of immortality. So really fitting to be at the Nativity. They had thought that the flesh of the peacock did not rot. So it was considered a symbol of immortality. So now taking a look at some of his other work and some of his other influences, we're going to see more images of the Nativity in the Frick's collection, as well as looking at some comparison images here. So this is what I was referring to before. This is Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, and you can see that there's the walled city in the background, and now you have Roman soldiers marching along that road, coming to arrest Christ and take him away. So that is, obviously very similar composition to what we see in the background of the Nativity. Excuse me. And here we have the earliest documented work by Giovanni di Paolo, which is actually a secular piece of work. It is a small wedding casket, and it's in the collection of the Louvre, and it dates to 1421. He, for a long time, his birth date, I think, was given as 1403, which would make him, quite young for this. And now most scholars think that it's probably sometime between 1395 and 1400, his birth date. So the marriage box is really quite special. I kind of wish there was a picture of it straight on so that we could see. It is Venus triumphant, and she is, sort of enthroned on this cloud with cupids around her, with these lovely female figures below her in a meadow, playing musical instruments. Around the outside, you have hounds chasing boars, sort of lovely mythological scene. A great quote, sorry, I was looking at my notes, but a really great quote that I love about Giovanni di Paolo is the art historian John Pope Hennessy, who wrote the book on Giovanni di Paolo, literally, and revisited his work many times over his long career, said that few experiences in Italian painting are more exciting than to follow Giovanni di Paolo as he plunges rabbit-like, like Alice, through the looking glass. And here is a fantastic little piece from 1427, which is pretty early in his career. And it is a flight into Egypt. And so you see Mary and Jesus on the donkey with Joseph following behind, and they're going past this little town. But what is really interesting about this little panel painting is that it is one of the earliest depictions of shadows in Western art. So if you look at the figures in the foreground, the Holy Family, they're moving like a frieze, sort of from left to right, relatively static, even though we know that they're moving across this landscape. They do not cast shadows, but the palm trees right behind them cast shadows, and the building casts shadows. So you can look for all those little spiky palm tree shadows throughout the composition. And people have written and talked about this painting. This is really showing an interest in naturalism and observation and depicting the world as it is, yet he's disregarded that for the Holy Family. So is it because they're not quite of the earth the way the rest of the landscape is, a sort of contrast between them? Nobody really knows what was going on in Giovanni di Paolo's mind, but it is such a kind of unusual and revolutionary thing depicting these shadows. He doesn't do it again and in his painting. And other artists at the time are making sort of similar kinds of breakthroughs. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. This is the Franchini Madonna, which is another early major commission of his that is really, really very beautiful. It was commissioned by the Franchini family for a chapel in the Church of San Domenico in Siena, Italy. And you see here, I mentioned earlier, the International Gothic style, this interest in luxury, and it is an incredibly beautiful decorative painting, as well as having this lovely relationship happening between the Madonna and child. And I think some sense of real dimension and weight to the baby's chubby arms and his fully rounded and formed face as he reaches up towards his mother, who is a little more sort of schematic, I think, in the representation of her facial features and even the way her hand just kind of rests under his foot. But my goodness, the beautiful fabrics that she is wearing and the incredible decorative background reminds us of the wealth of Siena, and it reminds us of that international trade and the interest in beautiful, rich fabrics that are being, many of them being manufactured in Italy as well. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about the context within which Giovanni di Paolo was working. So this is a really famous painting, Gentilly de Fabriano's Adoration of the Magi. And it is, you know, when you're looking at it like this on your computer screen, there's so much going on that it's kind of optically confusing. It is an altarpiece, and the paintings at the bottom, it's what we call the predella, the smaller paintings that are underneath the main altarpiece. And we'll look at some of the details of the predella as well. But when I talked about picking and choosing elements of the Renaissance, here you have this international Gothic style, this interest in it's court painting, it's painting about displaying wealth, and you can tell that at one glance. Look at all the gold, look at all the incredible embellishment on the individual characters in the painting, and how you know, they're displayed sort of so that we can see them all. But also look at the way the horses are depicted, really nicely foreshortened, and sort of naturalistic postures. So you have combinations of sort of influences happening. Gentilly de Fabriano is, his dates are 1370 to 1427. And he's also known for this complex storytelling and highly decorative painting. We should remember, or I'll remind all of us, that from 1305 to 1377, the papal court was at Avignon in France. And so there is this mixing, people going to Avignon to work, and this mixing of international styles and influences. And that's kind of what creates this this new style of painting. Gentilly de Fabriano was known to have been in Siena from June to September of 1425, working on a painting that has now been lost. So while he was in Siena, he likely made a deep impression on Giovanni di Paolo. He was, you know, highly regarded artist. He probably would have had assistants with him. It probably would have been a really exciting thing to be an artist in the town when Gentilly de Fabriano was there. And it's likely that Giovanni di Paolo would have, we don't know if he ever met him, if he worked with him, but he certainly would have been aware and around. And he was deeply, deeply influenced by that proximity. So this was just another sort of zoomed in close-up of Gentilly's Adoration, so that you can just see all of the incredible detail and luxury that has been so carefully delineated here. And now we're down at the predella. So the predella, this should look kind of familiar to you now that we've been through the Giovanni di Paolo. This is the small scene of the Nativity that's underneath that major, over the top, everything going on in it, Adoration we just looked at. And it's very simple here, and it's nighttime. So this little predella panel is quite famous for being one of the earliest night scenes depicted in Western art. But you see very similar sort of cave and architecture happening as we see in the Giovanni di Paolo. And you see, you know, Joseph dressed in the yellow robe turned to the side, and the two women. In fact, I'd say that here, the two female figures, Gentilly has got, you know, the one woman leaning on her hand much more, as she peers around, much more convincingly, whereas in the Giovanni di Paolo, if you look at that figure, she looks like she might like fall down on a slope because her hand doesn't really seem to be anchored on anything. Also look up there in the top right, because you have some little shepherds up in the top right as well. In fact, I think I pulled the shepherds out here, and here you can see them sort of all together, so you can get a better sense of the comparison. So there is a theory, I think at this point it's beyond theory because many art historians have all sort of weighed in on this, that Giovanni di Paolo had to have had a sketchbook where he had sort of kept a sort of inventory of figures and types and things to use in paintings, and that the visit of Gentilly de Fabriano provided a lot of material for his sketchbook, so that he was able to sort of choose figures and choose motifs and incorporate them into his own work for years afterwards. And you also see that the Madonna that I just showed was painted after Gentilly de Fabriano's visit to Siena. So you see that influence in some of his paintings of that decorative courtly style, as well as his interest in borrowing figures. And you can see I think Giovanni di Paolo's shepherds, which are on the bottom left, they're turned towards us, whereas Gentilly de Fabriano's are turned away. And I think maybe we get a little more of the astonishment because we can see their faces better because they're turned towards us. And then let's look at another influence of his, which is Sassetta, Stefano di Giovanni, who is the artist I mentioned, hangs right next to him. We have two pieces by Sassetta in the collection, and they hang right next to Giovanni di Paolo, and they are almost exactly the same lifetimes, except for the fact that Sassetta dies in 1450, and Giovanni di Paolo, who I don't have his caption on here because I didn't put it on every single image of this painting, but I believe he dies in 1482 or 3, going by my memory. So he lives much longer than Sassetta, who is his contemporary in Siena. Sassetta is noted, and you can see the great contrast in these two paintings when I talked about the room being, largely with sort of votive Sienese paintings with, potentially isolated figures and lots of gold ground. That's what you're seeing on the right. The really elegant, beautiful Madonna with, the sort of tender, sort of cheek to cheek position of the Madonna and Child, and that beautiful sort of line of their entwined bodies is very Sassetta. And if it's damaged on the bottom, so if you look at the bottom of the Sassetta, it's not very easy to read, but there is incised into the gold ground a tile floor. So there is a sense of perspective even in that painting, showing that Sassetta was also aware of Renaissance spatial innovations and was incorporating them even into this Virgin of Humility. She's called a Virgin of Humility because she's not enthroned, she's just sitting on a humble cushion. And so you can see, though, the contrast between these two artists. Sassetta is usually considered the more important of the two artists. So they're the two leading artists of 15th century Siena. And he, like Giovanni di Paolo, is this sort of last expression of the Gothic style associated with Siena. And it is what we're looking at on the right, the Virgin of Humility, is a small panel that was intended for private devotion. And it's just, a really beautiful painting in a very different way. So it is a painting that engenders contemplation and maybe appreciation of the beauty, whereas the Giovanni di Paolo painting on the left, you have to figure out, right? It's a narrative painting with a lot of things going on to figure out. So a really big contrast between these two artists who work together. Some folks have said some of that may be attributable to their patrons. So Sassetta did a lot of work for the Franciscans, who were associated with prayer. So works that were contemplative and devotional in that way would have been very important. And Di Paolo had a varied clientele, but a lot of Dominicans who were more associated with doctrine and active works and that sort of thing. And so the contrast in the way they paint and the subjects that they paint may have to do to an extent with who their patrons were. And just to have some fun and look at some, I talk about what an incredible, compelling storyteller Giovanni di Paolo is, and also that expressiveness that contemporary viewers find really compelling. I thought we should take a look at a few more pieces of his work. So this is Death in a Landscape. It is an illustration to the Office of the Dead that was commissioned around 1442, and it follows another severe outbreak of plague, which happened in 1437. So certainly death is on everyone's minds. And you can see this character, the fellow on the left, who is getting, death is taking aim right at his neck. He's kind of, what's happening in the foreground. It looks like he can't even try to get away from death, because it looks like there's a big chasm in the foreground. Like if he took a couple steps forward, he'd be falling off a cliff. And behind him is this kind of dense forest. And there he is, sort of trapped with death. And interestingly, Giovanni di Paolo did 61 images to accompany the Dante's Divine Comedy. So it was the 3 sections of the Divine Comedy. The 2 first sections had a different illustrator, but for the Paradiso, the 3rd section, Giovanni di Paolo created 61 images. And you can see in that top picture, the sun is just kind of raining down on these Tuscan hills, in that vivid, vivid blue sky, and the figures, Beatrice and Dante, are, sort of flying. They are in the other world and they are transported, and it's really beautiful. And then the image below, which to us might look surreal, is the Eagle of Justice, who is made up of the souls of just leaders. So if you read the Divine Comedy, it goes into some detail about the various souls that make up the Eagle of Justice. But here, Giovanni di Paolo has sort of literally made the body of this eagle out of many, many sort of haunting faces. And then here's an Adoration of the Magi, which clearly owes a lot to Gentilly de Fabriano as well. So really beautiful, incredible fabrics that everyone's wearing. And it's kind of like, a spectacle of luxury. And the one of the kings, kneeling down in front of Christ, and Christ's little hand on his head, and the 2 women behind Mary, the attendants, who seem to be kind of looking at one of the gifts. So again, a lot going on, but a lot, it's an amped up version of what we've seen in other Giovanni di Paolo nativities, because you have the luxury here, and even the structure and the cave, everything looks a little bit more glamorous than they do in our nativity. And then the painting on the right, both of these paintings are in the collection of the Met. The painting on the right is one that I see reproduced all the time online. People find it so compelling. It is the creation and the expulsion from paradise combined. So the world is being represented as this series of concentric circles or spheres, and this is a reference to Dante as well. So that that sort of mappamundo or creation of the world is happening on the left, and then on the right you have Adam and Eve being ejected from paradise, which has these wonderful fruit trees, which we know Giovanni di Paolo can beautifully paint, and at their feet are all sorts of, you know, flora and fauna, and they're being expelled. And at the bottom right, those are 4 rivers. On the left, you have paradise. So this is, you know, literally where heaven, or where you go, you know, when you have been saved, and you have a bunch of figures, including a pope in there, all having this really sort of lovely, I think John Pope Hennessy called it a garden party, and indeed that's what it looks like. Everyone is looking very civilized and very well dressed in a really gorgeous setting. And some more of his really vivid storytelling. And I forgot to, I'm sorry, the caption for this is wrong. I believe this painting's in a private collection. But St. Catherine of Siena, exchanging her heart with Christ. It, you know, is kind of as both as simple and as visceral as that sounds, as she is holding her heart out in her hand and handing it to him. Catherine of Siena, interestingly, this would have been a really meaningful commission to Giovanni di Paolo, not just because she's St. Catherine of Siena, but because her lifetime was close enough to his that he may have, you know, known people who knew her. They didn't overlap themselves, but he was commissioned, and this is one of 10 scenes from the life, from her life. And it was part of a larger altarpiece that was commissioned in 1447. And an even simpler nativity here, although look at the right-hand side and the way you're taken back up the hill with sheep and, you know, shepherds there on that very, very steep hillside that comes down almost like a waterfall. So while it is a later nativity from around the 1450s, and you really sort of focused on this very simple, I think the relationship between Mary and the baby actually being sort of gently placed on her own robe rather than directly on the ground. You know, that's what we notice. But then when you discover that landscape, your eye just climbs it. It's really quite incredible. And I have a personal story about this painting at the National Gallery London, looking at it and seeing those roses that are painted at the right and left. So often on a panel painting, you know, if you have multiple parts, you might have saints flanking a composition. I had never seen flowers done like this, and I was delighted, you know, to find that it was Giovanni di Paolo. And interestingly, though, we're looking at the backs, like sort of the back and underneath of these roses. So that is an extraordinary choice, I think, as well. Lovely and so charming, charmingly painted. And then St. John the Baptist retiring to the desert, it's a little bit like our shepherds in the Nativity, but in reverse. So we see, you know, John the Baptist 2 times, because we're seeing him leave home and we're seeing him head into the wilderness, and simultaneously. And it's very much like seeing the progression of the shepherds to the Nativity. And also, you know, that landscape, that incredible, expressive, rocky, kind of terrifying landscape he's heading into. And now to give a little bit of background, more background on the painting in our collection. So the provenance of our painting says that it was owned by Lady Somers, who lived at Eastnor Castle. And this is an image of the castle from a postcard from I think dating to around the 1840s. The castle was built, I think finished construction around 1814. And it looks to me like the collection associated with the family was divided amongst heirs sometime around 1920. Helen Clay Frick ends up with the painting in 1925. So it's kind of fun to see the castle and imagine that the Giovanni di Paolo might have hung there. It is listed as Gentilly de Fabriano and a 1913, I believe, exhibition catalog of loans from the collection. And then it goes from there to Karl Hamilton, who's a really interesting character. And here he's being shown in a portrait sketch that's in the collection of the North Carolina Museum of Art. Karl Hamilton died in 1967, and he was a collector who at one time, was assembling this amazing Italian Renaissance painting collections. He I don't have his birth date written down. I'm sorry to say that, but I can read you an excerpt of his New York Times obituary, which is kind of colorful. Mr. Hamilton, the child of a poverty-stricken family, first worked as a shoeshine boy on the streets of his native Hollidaysburg, PA. With the aid of scholarships, he worked his way through Mercersburg Academy and Yale University, from which he was graduated in 1913. He worked in Pennsylvania steel mills and years later headed a group of companies that produced copra oil in the Philippines. It was in this venture that he made a fortune. So not a lot of people, talk about Karl Hamilton's collecting, but he was very interested in Renaissance painting. Duveen worked with him a lot, although eventually there was a lawsuit. He was one of the people who was frustrated by Sir Joseph Duveen's business practices, and not the only one, but he had an amazing collection in Manhattan with sculpture, tapestry, Renaissance paintings, all sorts of bric-a-brac, and ended up moving to an apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan that was 14 rooms large in order to house part of that collection. I'm not sure why he sold the painting. It ended up going to bourgeois galleries and then was purchased in 1925 by Helen Clay Frick. Be fun to have some time actually in the office with the right resources to do some more research on this. But here's Helen, I love this, circa 1939 in her office with the Giovanni di Paolo Nativity hanging on the wall behind her. And, I think you can tell that's what it is on the left, but if not, there's a little bit of an enlargement there on the right where you can clearly see the figure of the Madonna and her incredibly long upper body. And then just for fun, I also included a picture of the back of the painting. So these paintings, and this would be a whole nother lecture to talk about the technique and an interesting one, the technique that artists use for making panel paintings, which is tempera, usually on poplar panel. And a conservation technique that is not done at all anymore. It is not recommended or advised, but years ago, they would often do what they called cradling the panel. They thought it would help protect the wood panel, and because wood responds to humidity, by putting this grid on the back of it, which is called a cradle, which has a little bit of movement to it, it would both hold the panel flat and rigid, but also correct, I guess, some of the movement that might happen because of humidity. But it is actually, I think people now think they are more damaging than they are helpful, but you don't want to take a cradle off once the panel has been cradled. But here you can see the back, and at the top there are these little index cards on it, and it actually has a handwritten note saying that the painting goes in Helen Clay Frick's office behind her couch on the west wall or whatever wall it is. So kind of fun to see that. I actually have that exact quote written down here somewhere. Over couch, east wall, Frick Library, 6th floor, property of Miss Helen Clay Frick. So that's exactly what is said on the little card. And then I included this image of St. Clair rescuing the shipwrecked because it was all over. It was for sale at Christie's December 3rd of 2019. So this image was being reproduced in all the art publications and in everybody who's involved in the art world social media feeds a lot in November and December. And it's still popping up frequently because people find the image so compelling. And I thought that this would be fun. This is what the art newspaper said about the painting when it was coming up for auction this December. St. Clair is in full superhero mode, flying through the air to rescue Pisans from a ship in dark and stormy sea, resembling a field of molehills. And the young St. Clair, the other painting from the series, which I didn't include here, is the young St. Clair receiving the clothes of her order from St. Francis. But this shipwreck scene, which came up for auction in December, was an auction record for Giovanni di Paolo work. It went for £5.3 million, which I think is about $6.5 million. It is a pretty small painting. I think it's about 8 by 12 inches. But again, expressive and imaginative and intense. So, you know, while we see all these sort of bubbling, what they described as molehills of the sea in this very sort of schematic, repetitive way, each one kicking up little bits of froth and foam. It's really compelling and powerful and full of this energy that Giovanni di Paolo seems to impart his, you know, narrative visions with. And these visions that combine the real and the mystical in a really special way. And so with that said, I'm gonna let you look at the painting again and read you a little bit of the conclusion. So Giovanni di Paolo and Sassetta, both these artists of Siena in the 15th century, often get described in comparison to the artists of Florence as somehow not measuring up or not fully realizing the importance of Renaissance humanism, or even, you know, maybe being resistant to change. They're clinging to this tradition in Siena. They're looking to the past. But again, I'm going to go back to John Pope Hennessy, who felt otherwise. He said that both Giovanni di Paolo and Sassetta made, quote, their own informed choice against the values of the Florentine Renaissance. And I really liked that phrase, informed choice, because that gives power to these Sienese artists. It shows that they made that informed choice to try to meld their city's decorative tradition with innovations in composition that were happening of the time. And I do think that it creates a really sort of special species of art. So I'm going to pop back on and say thanks again for watching. And as usual, we love to hear from you. And we're trying, as we work from home, to take requests, as I often say. So if there's anything you're interested in, you can shoot an email to info@frickart.org, at frickpittsburgh.org, sorry, info@thefrickpittsburgh.org. And we will try to respond. Thanks again.